Please be seated. Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Martin Munu will defend the academic thesis, Designing Development-Oriented International E-Commerce Agreements. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Dear Prorector, members of the Corona, family, friends here in this hall and online, with gratitude, I hereby present to you the findings of my study under the theme Designing Development-Oriented International E-Commerce Agreements. So what is e-commerce? This is a question that I've been thinking about a lot, this subject. E-commerce is the production, distribution, marketing, sale, or delivery of goods and services by electronic means. Now, this is part of the overall big issue or concept of what we call digital economy. And digitalization has increased in all areas of production, supply of goods and services, creating an encompassing understanding of this concept as digital economy. So from the production aspect of goods and services to the marketing and sale and distribution of it, all of us have in a way used e-commerce either as a consumer or as a seller, but also as a producer. Whether directly or you would have consumed any product that has been traded through electronic means. So that is e-commerce. E-commerce has huge significance for our economy. It has both challenges, but also presents opportunities for developing countries, and especially the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises that constitute a big component of the economies of developing countries. And developing countries with low level of digital capacity are the most affected. In this case, the developing countries, I call them digitally developing countries. Now, these are a subset of countries that have lower capabilities in the digital economy, and I use the UNCTAD E-Trade for All initiative and the UNCTAD 2020 e-commerce index that looks at the readiness of countries to trade online. And so the countries that are at these lower levels, that are less competitive, form part of what I term DDCs. And so in the group of DDCs, we have developing countries like China that have higher capabilities of digital capacity are not included, even though in the World Trade Organization, they identify as developing countries. So in terms of opportunities, e-commerce presents market access for MSMEs from DDCs. And now this market access is very important because it enables these countries to reach the markets both domestically but also externally. And this is where they generate revenues. And these revenues have the ripple effects across the entire economy. But the main challenge here is increased competition because in the digital platforms, even these MSMEs from DDCs have to compete with sophisticated companies that have high levels of capabilities, both in terms of production, but also technology. So from the flip side, then we have this increased competition. Let's look at the international regulation of e-commerce. So e-commerce is mainly regulated at two levels. First, through regional trade agreements, and secondly, through the World Trade Organization. Now, through regional trade agreements, I call them RTAs, there is increasing RTAs with e-commerce chapters, also known as digital trade chapters. And so these are trade agreements with a group of countries within the same region or even beyond that move much deeper with their level of economic integration. And so they now increasingly have a chapter that is dedicated to regulating e-commerce. At the WTO level, also known, I also call it the multilateral level, the WTO has different agreements that are of relevance or that cover e-commerce. There is no specific agreement at the WTO, but we have the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that regulates goods and services, goods, and it has elements of e-commerce in it. We also have the General Agreement on Trade and Services that has components of e-commerce in terms of regulation. But there is also the intellectual property rights, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, the TRIPS agreement, and the Trade Facilitation Agreement that has elements that addresses e-commerce, and the Information Technology Agreement, especially for the sale of computer-related products. But members of the WTO are also moving in to create an e-commerce agreement, but as a plurilateral agreement, and this is under the Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce. So they launched negotiations for an e-commerce agreement, and they came up with the JSI stabilized text, which is now open for acceptance by members and the overall integration in the WTO. All these components of e-commerce, the various elements of e-commerce, both at the regional level, but also at the WTO level, affect the regulation of e-commerce at the national level. So my research question here is, looking at this context, is how should international e-commerce agreements be designed to meet the development objectives of digitally developing countries? In addressing this question, I employed a doctrinal method, a normative method, and a comparative method. In the terms of doctrinal method, I needed to first understand how the various agreements are related to e-commerce before I look at the normative aspect of how should these then agreements be designed. In terms of comparative methodology, I compared the various regional trade agreements that have e-commerce chapters, but also the JSI. And from that, I bring to you the structure of my research, which introduces the subject in chapter 1 with identifying the methodologies and the scope. In chapter 2, I present the conceptual and theoretical understanding of e-commerce, digital economy, and development. Chapter 3, I focus on e-commerce and MSMEs in digitally developing countries with a selection of a few countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda for a deep analysis. Chapter 4, I construct a development-oriented analytical framework for e-commerce agreements. Now, in Chapter 5, I analyze the e-commerce provisions in regional trade agreements. In Chapter 6, I look at the JSI stabilized text and what they mean for digitally developing countries. Then I conclude in Chapter 7. So what are my key findings? First, a development-oriented e-commerce agreement has to balance several aspects of the digital economy. But I use the UN Sustainable Development Goal, especially Goal 17, which looks at global partnership, technology transfer, capacity building, and trade as a tool for development. So in terms of balancing the mainstream approaches, there is a mainstream approach of liberalizing trade or protecting trade, and also the national efforts. And I bring 6 factors. First, the e-commerce agreement should facilitate imports and exports. Secondly, it should address tariffs as a form of government revenue. Third, it should attract investment into the digital economy. Fourth, it should preserve policy space for other non-trade objectives that are important to countries. The fifth is to provide for development assistance. And lastly, it should provide for different rights and obligations according to development levels. There are major approaches to e-commerce regulation. First, we have the US approach that looks at more liberalization and less role of the state in regulation. Then we have the Chinese approach that looks at the sovereignty, so a strong role of the state in controlling e-commerce, as well as they promote market access. Then we have the EU approach that is more balanced, balancing trade liberalization with regulation to promote societal goals, and also some aspects which helps in some aspects of promoting development. So all these approaches are reflected in e-commerce agreements, and the members of these different countries seek to have their respective approaches reflected in regional trade agreements, but also at the WTO. And here, I find that the US approach is more reflected in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTIP, and the United States, Mexico, and Canada Agreement. And the Chinese approach is more reflected in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that's the RCEP, and the EU approach is more reflected in the Trade Cooperation Agreement between the EU and the UK, and the African Continental Free Trade Area Digital Trade Protocol. In terms of provisions, substantively, we see that the RTS and the JSI stabilized text has various provisions. One that facilitates or increases trade in digital products, such as, for instance, issues to do with recognition of e-signatures, paperless trading, but also the permanent moratorium on the imposition of tariffs. And then they also have provisions to do with consumer protection, that is to allow countries or to allow members to implement measures at the national level that protect their consumers online. There are also provisions to deal with regulating e-commerce to promote cybersecurity, and some agreements, especially the AFCFTA DTP and the JSI stabilized text, has provisions on digital trade inclusivity. For instance, the indigenous peoples, the measures that can facilitate their development and integration in the global economy. They also have provisions for transparency and cooperation. But there are exceptions to these agreements, and these exceptions kind of follow the WTO approach on exceptions, and these exceptions look like areas where the countries are allowed to implement measures contrary to these obligations to achieve other objectives. It could be plant or animal or health life. But there are also security exceptions, and there's also some specific exceptions in this agreement that allows countries to implement measures such as consumer protection or indigenous peoples, like I mentioned. And there are also special and differential treatment, or SDT provisions in this agreement. But the issue is, especially for the JSI stabilized text, they don't go as far as the trade facilitation agreement that categorizes different provisions. And then there is the non-application of the dispute settlement mechanism as an exception. I bring now to you my recommendation. First, in terms of e-commerce agreement, for it to be development-oriented, we should consider a balanced approach along the 6 elements I identified. So the balanced approach allows us to take on the benefits of trade liberalization, but also allow some bit of protection. For instance, the permanent moratorium should be considered to facilitate e-commerce, but then there should also be some level of protection to allow countries to implement development-oriented industrial policies. Very importantly is that we should apply SDT in terms of a sufficient transition period for DDCs, such that these countries can build capacity and close the digital divide, and they're able to compete in the international markets. And the non-application of the dispute settlement mechanism as for DDCs would allow countries to implement some measure that could be contrary, but other countries would not challenge these measures under the the dispute settlement mechanism, such that these countries can be able to develop and better integrate. And we also need the self-designation of the provisions that countries can be able to implement, and also the provisions that countries need support to implement them. And this should be conditional on these countries receiving technical assistance and capacity building, as it is in the trade facilitation agreement. With this, I thank you for your time, and I push the floor back to the prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor Anke Moerland. Professor Moerland is a Professor of Intellectual Property, Frontier Technologies and International Trade here at Maastricht University, and she was the chair of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, I would like to express my compliments for a very well-written, well-structured and encompassing study on a highly relevant topic. Not only is e-commerce an ever-growing, if not dominant form of doing business in our world economy and presents its own challenges. At the same time, the question of doing business with each other based on rules agreed upon in trade agreements is under immense pressure. I think your study is of great value for understanding how adequate rules in trade agreements can promote development in developing countries to the benefit of all countries. So next to these compliments, I'm also here to ask a few critical questions. Your main research question entails how e-commerce agreements should be designed to promote the development objectives of developing countries. In order to answer this question, you need to analyze what the rules of these agreements entail, what the development objectives of developing countries are, and then whether the relationship is one of promoting or not. In your methodology, you indeed describe that you use legal doctrinal research, you also presented this today, to analyze the agreements, and normative legal research on establishing whether the law has either a positive or negative effect on development. My question, however, pertains to how you established the development objectives of digitally developing countries. You explain that you use insights from development studies, and in particular prior empirical studies, instead of an empirical standalone methodology. I presume that means that you did not carry out an empirical study into the development objectives of developing countries in relation to e-commerce. You also state you rely on the Sustainable Development Goals 17 in particular for the perspective that global cooperation supports the realization of sustainable development. But both development studies and the work on the SDG 17 do not provide a clear and detailed view of developing countries' preferences in relation to e-commerce. At the same time, you acknowledge yourself on page 266, it is important to situate discussions around development within the digital trade context by considering the particular conditions existent in developing countries and LDCs. So my question to you is, would an empirical study into the preferences of relevant developing countries have been necessary in light of the central role they play in your research question? And in your choice not to pursue this, how did you mitigate the limits of relying on general theoretical insights in assessing the effect of detailed provisions in free trade agreement on the development objectives related to e-commerce? Thank you very much for your answer.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for reading my thesis. Your question is actually what I've also been looking into for the last few years in my research. In terms of looking at the development objectives and the preferences of DDCs, I thought about an empirical study, but I saw the importance of looking at what these countries present at the negotiating forums. Now, at the WTO, DDCs are part of WTO members that have been deliberating e-commerce issues for many years under the 1998 work program on one side, and also under the various elements of different countries making proposals for e-commerce agreement. So one, DDCs have consistently identified the need to bridge the digital divide, the need to build domestic capacity, and the need to address the underlying constraints to their development before they can engage in e-commerce. And so these submissions provide very strong justification of what they need for their development. Secondly, DDCs have also identified national development plans that clearly points out what they need or the areas they need to build capacity, but also the specific strategies that they have put in place are demonstrated in these national development plans. And because of that, I identified 3 countries that enable me to have a deeper understanding of what the development objectives of these countries. And here I looked at Uganda, like I mentioned earlier, Kenya, and Rwanda. And I realized that in broad sense, these countries are interested in further integration into the global economy, but they want some form of integration that facilitates their MSMEs to be integrated in a meaningful way. And they also identified the need to build their capacity through international collaboration, working with different development partners. But these countries also, very importantly, have implemented measures at the domestic level to promote digitalization, to ensure that their companies can be able to compete. But it's very clear that they have a lot of constraints, supply-side constraints, but also financial constraints that undermine this. And because of this, I found their development objectives clearly identified, which provides a good substitute for an empirical study. Secondly, in the SDG 17, there are clear elements, targets that the global community identified in terms of addressing trade negotiations at the WTO to enable trade to be used to facilitate development. And this also is a reason why DDC is a bit reluctant to join the Joint Statement Initiative, or even to negotiate already a multilateral rule on e-commerce, because they feel at the WTO and also the SDGs, there's a framework, there's a promise to address development, to also address the earlier mandated issues at the WTO. For instance, we have the Doha Ministerial Declaration that has specific elements of areas that countries are supposed to agree on, but unfortunately, there is still no agreement. And even with the changing global dynamics, it is going to be a little bit even harder to complete this agreement. But these are the objectives that these countries feel should be addressed. And they also have allies among the least developed country group and the African group. I go back to the empirical nature, whether it would have been good. I also recognize it would have been good, but considering what I did for my study, all these submissions, the WTO, as well as the elaborate national development plans, I believe that my study provides a very good framework along these 6 factors that even another research or any future research or anybody who would like to have an empirical research, it would be interesting for them to rely on these 6 factors as a starting point. So I see my contribution as if another research would look at an empirical nature of research to be conducted, the starting point of using the 6 factors would be very, very key in this case. Thank you.
Professor Moerland looks happy. In that case, we will continue the opposition, in this case, with Professor David Collins. Professor Collins is a professor of international economic law at the City St. George University of London. I welcome you to Maastricht University and should mention that you were also a member of the assessment committee.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed reading your thesis, and the question that I have for you is this. It would appear that one of the arguments of your thesis is that the concept of development is inherently different in the context of digital trade than it is in traditional trade. If that's true, if I'm right that that is one of your arguments that you're making, could you elaborate on that point and how precisely you arrived at that conclusion?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question and for taking the time to read my thesis. The concept of development as being inherently different when you look at e-commerce. I only look at e-commerce as bringing something transformative. And so we then would not need to have business as usual approach when we are doing trade policy analysis or trade negotiations. Because e-commerce, as part of the digital economy, there's been a lot of innovations. And even within weeks or months, we already see changes. But these innovations build on the ability of countries to trade and the competitiveness of their companies, bringing both challenges but also opportunities. So the difference I see here is that the transformative nature of e-commerce and the readiness of countries are quite different. And so we need an approach that recognizes the difference in readiness to close the digital divide. But in any case, the development trajectory would still be the same when you look at the issue of increasing exports, building the capacity of countries, and benefiting from global trade. So for me, I only looked from my research at the transformative element, the transformative nature that digitalization brings, that enables countries to be more competitive and leaving others behind. Thank you for that.
I see Professor Collins nodding, so that is a good sign, meaning that we now continue the defense and opposition with Dr. Maarten Smeets. Dr. Smeets is a senior associate at International Trade Law at the Klingendahl Institute, was also a member of the assessment committee, and I welcome you very much at Maastricht University.
Thank you very much. Let me also commend you on good research, deep research on a very topical issues in a world where competition is on AI and technologies, and the e-commerce agreement is particularly important in that respect. Just assume that the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Dr. Ngozi, has read your PhD and she wants your advice. She has read it carefully, and in light of the upcoming ministerial conference later this month in Yaoundé, Cameroon, she would like to have some discussion with you and your views on a particularly sensitive issue, which is the moratorium that is deemed to end at the end of this month unless there's an agreement to extend it. I believe you suggest in your writings that the moratorium should be ended in order for developing countries to benefit from the tariff revenues. That is what normally would happen at the end of this month in Cameroon if it is not extended. However, I refer to a study that you also have used in your analysis, which is this joint WTO, IMF, OECD, UN, World Bank study from 2 years ago, which also interestingly is entitled Digital Trade for Development. So there's a comparison there, which explains actually that the tax revenues will be very limited, between 0.01% and 0.3% on tax revenues. It also notes that due to the significant rise of FTAs that you have pointed out in your explanations, the tax collection actually won't apply between many of the members because the nature of the free trade agreements, which means that there's no taxation. It also notes that the burden of collecting taxes, the administrative cost is very significant. And we know that many developing countries also develop, but many developing countries have difficulties doing so. So then the report suggests that maybe it would be good to substitute tariffs by value-added taxes, domestic value-added taxes, as a way of collecting tax revenue. So the question from DG Ngozi is to ask you, can you please explain and elaborate on your position in light of these considerations, given the limitation of revenue that it will generate, a high administrative cost? And alternatively, could you perhaps agree with the arguments in the joint study and to perhaps substitute the tariffs by way of applying VAT taxes, also in view of the fact that it is non-discriminatory? I hope my question is clear.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. The moratorium has been a very tricky issue for members. But what we have seen from 1998, members have always been extending this moratorium. And so the argument of imposing tariffs, in this case from one side, could be seen as challenged by that factor. That even though the agreement might, we might be arguing this way in our research, members have always extended this moratorium. From my study, I look at tariffs as an industrial policy. So the revenue generation aspect is, of course, very important, but it's also an industrial policy tool that countries can use. And what is happening of recent across the world, we've seen, again, countries, the issue of tariffs as an industrial policy becoming even more prominent. Could be worryingly on one side for global trade, but maybe it also provides a good support to DDCs that have argued a lot in terms of revenue generation. So if I'm to meet DG, I would be faced by this difficult a situation that you've already alluded. But from one element, we need to have a much broader way of looking at this agreement. And this is why my balanced approach, which is also within the concept of an embedded liberalism, important for us to look at. On one side, the moratorium has facilitated trade in digital products across the world, in digital transmitted products, also in line with the information technology agreement. And we have managed to bridge the digital divide a lot. So MSMEs, even from DDCs, have been able to trade, to access digital products, in part also thanks to the moratorium. And this is one issue where if you look at it from that angle, you find a strong justification for keeping it permanent. And this is why many countries have also made that the US proposal for now for the next ministerial conference is actually to make it also permanent. We are also seeing a lot of move from countries that have traditionally been opposed to this, maybe rethinking it, with different studies coming out. But UNCTAD also had a series of studies on this that looked at the potential revenue losses. The strong point from UNCTAD study for maintaining, for eliminating this moratorium is that the digital economy is only expected to grow. And there's that blurred link between now a good and a service. What was earlier provided as a good, a tangible product can already be provided using digital means, and then they cross borders. So much as the general agreement on trade and services can cover this, it's only expected to increase. For instance, under the tariff accords, we could play cassette tapes, then it came to DVDs, but now you just stream online. And previously, DDCs could get some revenue from the importation of these DVDs or even the players, but now a consumer just goes on phone and then they can listen to their music or watch their movies or in their smart television sets. So from that element, with what we have seen on the increment of digital technologies and the innovation, the quick nature of the innovation that digitalization brings, it is plausible to say that many of the products we consume now, the value of those products, either how they are transmitted or also the consumption patterns may change, will be digital. And DDCs have some, what they offered in the GATS, they still have some leeway, or what they offered in the GATT, they still have some leeways to impose tariffs, and the WTO allows that. So it is a tool they have, even though they might decide to keep a lower applied rate, but that tool remains for them to apply. So it remains an important industrial development tool. So the balancing elements of this is the challenge that countries face. And this is why I argue that we need SDTs, a longer transition period, and the non-application of the dispute settlement mechanism. And if developing, if DDCs provided with the kind of technical assistance and capacity building that they need, it would be much easier that even though the moratorium is made permanent, even some DDCs and even companies from DDCs already also rely on this. it would be much easier for them to have this moratorium permanent, but which is backed with technical assistance and capacity building. And the SDT approach that I mentioned is the self-categorization of provisions. So I would tell the Director General that, well, yeah, we have this option. Let's make this moratorium, we could make it permanent, as many members have really been proposing. But then we also have the provisions that DDCs, because they are diverse, we cannot know all DDCs what they want. Some DDCs may be actually be interested in more digital trade. They might not even be producing. They might have less to even protect. So even the protection may not even be in their interest. But then they can have that option of choosing. Really, that these are the provisions that I need technical assistance and capacity building before I can implement. And especially if we have the issue of self-declaration of developing countries. This is one reason why members have struggled to reach an agreement. It is not, for instance, it would not be expected of EU members, for instance, to allow China, that has a very strong capability in the digital economy, to claim the developing country status. And this is also partly why I argue that the EU approach is of paramount importance. So if those provisions are allowed, and there is clear categorization of countries as DDCs, so these DDCs, there's even less incentive for developed country members to oppose such a measure, because in any case, these countries are really very low level, and a lot of these developed country members have several capacity development and international cooperation agreements or frameworks to try to promote development in these countries. So it would be easier for them to agree in that sense. Thank you very much.
I see Dr. Smeets smiling, so I think that we can continue. The opposition now is Dr. Iveta Alexovica. And Dr. Iveta is an assistant professor in international economic law here at this university, and she was equally a member of the assessment committee.
Thank you very much. Dear Martin, let me join others in expressing my compliments for the work that you've done for this beautiful book. I also enjoyed reading it. What I found particularly interesting was the theoretical analytical framework that you developed in order to assess whether the agreements that you discussed in your book were development-oriented or not, and to what extent. So my question relates to that. You've proposed, or you've developed 6 criteria against which you were assessing these agreements. And I have been wondering all the time as I was reading your thesis, how much weight should each of them get? And whether they are, in your understanding, equally important, or whether their weight is different. Also on your slides, you actually had this scale, which was in perfect balance, 6 criteria, 3 on the right, 3 on the left. At the same time, in your conclusions, that was also on your slides, you seem to be suggesting that the special differential treatment provisions and the technical assistance and capacity building that you've also emphasized just now when answering the previous question, as if they were more important than the other 4 criteria. So I would like you to maybe explain this, and seeing that I may not have a chance to ask my second question, maybe I could sneak an element into this question as well. Would this be different for different DDCs, excuse me. So depending on their own development, digital development needs, would that weight of each of the criterion be different? Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. The analytical framework provides a good tool for me to do, provided a good tool for me to do the analysis, and I present it as something that researchers, policymakers, but also trade negotiators especially need to consider. Now, in terms of weighing them, whether each criteria as is more important than the other, this is something that countries need to look at. In its broader sense, this is a comprehensive, it's a package that you need to look at it in its broadest sense. But SDT capacity building comes out strongly because they are very complementary to each of the 6 factors. I start with facilitating import and exports, for instance. Now, DDCs, some of them, and also as I wrote in my book, some of them are landlocked, like Uganda and Rwanda. And these countries have constraints in accessing the sea, which is the cheapest transportation means for international trade. And even though an e-commerce agreement can facilitate that, for instance, paperless trading or recognition of e-signatures, this is an important element to facilitate imports and exports. But there are still these supply-side constraints that these countries face. And this makes that particular criteria of capacity building very important, because capacity building would enable these countries to address these constraints in terms of roads, for instance, construction of roads, construction of railway lines, facilitating trade facilitation measures in terms of clearing, customs support, clearing and forwarding of goods, and also building the capacity of MSMEs to be more productive and more competitive. So in that case, then you are having MSMEs, we are having a criteria that supports MSMEs to be more competitive, to be more productive, to improve their engagement in the digital economy, such that those provisions that facilitates imports and exports, they would be able to take advantage of. Another area I could bring is attracting investment in the digital economy. Now, DDCs have over the years had a lot of shortfall in investment, even putting aside the digital economy. Now, the kind of investment that is needed to enable trade to be used as a tool for development, this investment is both soft investment, but also in the hard investment. The digital ecosystem needs to be upgraded. For instance, the internet access and affordability, but also the use, actually, the ease for communities or traders to use the internet. So that requires huge investment. And these countries lack the resources for this kind of investment. So on one side, we need an e-commerce agreement to facilitate trade in a nature that countries then are allowed to promote investment such that they can take advantage of the open markets. For instance, if it is already now easier for DDCs to import and export, and market access has been promoted by the e-commerce agreement, but then you need investment to enable countries to tap into it, also for the global value chain, which is a good concept. Now, integrating DDC MSMEs in the global value chain goes beyond their own abilities. And so you need to attract investment to build digital ecosystems. You need to attract investment to promote production, such that these countries can also tap into the various opportunities that come from them. You also mentioned the issue of SDT, why from my main conclusion it is coming out much more clearly, much more prominent, and so whether they could be more important. I incidentally really wouldn't put like too much weight on one criteria. I just look at the peculiar contribution that each criteria makes and how they complement each other. What is interesting about this criteria is that some of them are even could be conflicting. For instance, on one side, you want to promote imports and exports, but also from the other, you need policy space for other non-trade objectives, but also you need digital industrial policies to implement, which might require the application of some measures that can be trade restrictive. SDT, I find it as providing a bridge such that countries or members can undertake all the elements of trade liberalization, but they have some leeway not to implement some provisions because of the level of their development. And this is a concept that has been there for a very long time in the multilateral trading system. This is recognized by both developed countries and developing countries, and it is one of the sticky points at the WTO on how to treat countries such that they can benefit from SDT. And this is, like I mentioned earlier, this is why China becomes, the China issue becomes a tricky part, because they have more capabilities than other developed countries. So if an e-commerce agreement is made in such a way that it allows the application of these SDTs, and it allows countries to identify provisions that they need, that they can already implement immediately. For instance, it is easier to implement paperless trading, for instance, or recognition of e-signatures. Then this could be an area that it doesn't require much. So these countries then would then just implement them. It is easy to implement them, but the effect on promoting the integration of the MSMEs into the digital economy and international trade is enormous. And so you have this provision that is easy to implement, and yet this provision is very important in facilitating trade and in ensuring that MSMEs can be able to reach international markets, but also trade domestically. But there's also some other provisions that require some bit that require time. For instance, countries may need to undertake review of their legal frameworks to allow for it. For instance, like source code disclosure, the issue of protecting personal data. So countries might need additional time, but also they might also need even capacity building, such that they can draft those laws in a way that can be able to protect the rights of their e-commerce traders or consumers. So such kind of measures, then that additional time, the SDT would allow DDCs that additional time or flexibility to have that additional time or transition period, we call it, such that they can be ready before then they implement. Then the last category of provisions are the provisions that need technical assistance before countries can implement. So DDCs may, for instance, put the moratorium under such kind of provisions, or other specific provisions that, for instance, cybersecurity, that they then need technical assistance if they don't have the sophisticated technologies and the human resources to effect them. Then in that sense, you have three categories of provision that provides a substantive or comprehensive framework for the countries to implement all the 6 criteria at different points with support and agreement from other developed country partners. So in that sense, I see my 6 criteria as complementing each other. I see them as a package, and I see each as contributing its unique, each as contributing in its unique way. Thank you.
Thank you for your elaborate answer. That made undoubtedly Dr. Rivetta happy. We then continue the opposition with Dr. André Núñez-Chaip. Dr. Núñez-Chaip is an assistant professor in globalization and law at this university.
Dear candidate, thank you very much for your presentation, and I too enjoyed very much reading your thesis. And my question also addresses your analytical framework, but from a different perspective. So in your thesis, you recognize that development includes economic, social, and environmental spheres. right? And you base its normative framework in these SDGs, which are, in their turn, based on the 3 pillars of sustainable development established in the Rio Declaration. However, the normative criteria you developed in your chapter 4 predominantly emphasize economic factors, such as imports and exports, tariffs, investment, development assistance, special and differential treatment, and policy space, with a focus mainly on the data protection, privacy, and cybersecurity. Now, the environmental dimension in this case appears somewhat underrepresented. And this, I would like to ask you, why wasn't environmental sustainability included as a distinct criterion within your analytical framework, especially considering that e-commerce produces significant environmental externalities, such as, especially relevant for the developing in the digital dependent countries, including the carbon footprint, for instance, of data centers, the electronic waste, packaging waste, and the energy demands of expanding telecommunication networks. And if you had established environmental sustainability as a distinct criterion, how would that inclusion have affected the assessment of the development orientation of the various agreements you examined?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and the interest in my study and the analytical framework. Now, looking at the SDGs, all these elements is the reason why SDGs becomes important in this study of mine. You also rightly pointed out that there was a lot of focus on the economic factors. I'd like to start from that point. Now, trade is a lot to do with economics. So from one side, DDCs have ambition, and their ambition is actually to get from the point A where they are, which is less developed countries with a lot of social, economic, and environmental factors, to a point where they have a bit of high mass consumption, they're able to trade, they're able to uplift more people from poverty, and they're able to be competitive in the global economy. And so the entry point for trade here has a lot to do with demand and supply, which is the basis of economics. But the balancing elements that I bring in my research covers bits and pieces of the environmental factors. For instance, in terms of attracting investment in the digital economy, I argue that DDCs would need e-commerce agreements to be framed in a way that when they're implementing their digital industrial policies, there are also green digital industrial policies. For instance, aspects of e-waste, the issue of the cost of cloud computing, hosting the data at the data centers, and the elements of indigenous peoples, which also has aspects of protection of the environment. So indeed, the environmental factors are covered, but upon the analysis of the various, the selected RTS and the JSI stabilized text, it's also a lot to do with the economics elements of it, and by extension, the social element, because once you improve the economic element, then countries are able to uplift people from poverty. And the first, the prioritization of people's welfare, when you look at the aspect that trade brings, the economic factors becomes paramount, but the environmental factors, in this case, their importance, I argue it in terms of the digital industrial policies that allows for the implementation of green technologies. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you for your answer. This provides us the opportunity for a second round of questions. Professor Moerland, you can ask a brief question, please.
Thank you very much. My second question addresses your comparative perspective. You have analyzed important regional trade agreements, including agreements in which also developing countries are partners. In addition, you have characterized the main approaches to e-commerce regulation. You also presented them, those of the US, China, and the EU. And both selections seem to indicate a rather neo-colonial perspective on the regulation of e-commerce. It seems major players determine the conditions under which e-commerce is regulated and can take place, and that developing countries seem to be the receivers of these rules. My question pertains to the fact as to whether, in your research, you also came across a more proactive agenda setting on behalf of the developing countries themselves that are expressed in certain agreements among themselves, which would have merited the analysis of a DDC approach next to the US, EU, and China. So in essence, could you explain whether you saw the role of DDCs merely as reactive to the dominant approaches, or whether there is also a DDC approach in itself? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponents, thank you very much for your second question. Now, the comparative methodology applied in looking at the various RTS and the review of various national regulations that led to a conclusion of the three approaches: the US approach, the Chinese approach, and the EU approach. First, these countries, the digital economy is something evolving. Of course, it has taken a long time, but not very long like a traditional trade. And I found out that these three jurisdictions, they have reached some high level of national regulation of e-commerce. First, these three jurisdictions are the leaders in the digital economy in terms of innovations, but even digital trade. And these three countries are also, these three jurisdictions, they lead trade in goods, both trade in goods and trade in services. So when you look at globalization and all aspects of international trade, you see the US playing a prominent role for centuries. You see the EU, you brought in the aspect of neocolonialism, the EU countries, the EU member states, but also now the UK after Brexit, played a very expansive role in terms of extraction of resources from the global south and dominating global trade in that aspect. And China, we see it as a giant that has emerged, that now it's placing even the developed countries. They are now asking themselves on what measures they need to do to counter China. So these three approaches then become prominent. One, in terms of regulation, they have that high level of regulation. They're the drivers of globalization. And they have developed, there's also some bit of competition amongst themselves. And each has identified how they need to position themselves in international trade, with e-commerce as an entry point, how they need to regulate e-commerce. And these regulations are written in the national laws. My research did not go deeply, my scope was not to look at those national regulations, but I just used it as a basis for looking at how countries are prepared, what is emerging to provide that typology. Now, DDCs, one would argue that they are being reactive in this case. You have a point, because even at the WTO, developing countries always have over the years had less proposals, and a lot of even proposals in the digital economy. Even the JSI is coming from these countries or these jurisdictions. The EU has proposals, the US has proposals, and China has proposals. And incidentally, some of the US proposals, they have changed. For instance, they also need some bit of regulation. The strong role of the state, we're also seeing it coming. But when you look at the agreements that the US are involved in, it is that liberal approach. And it ties in with the overall aspects of international trade, where, and I discussed this extensively in my conceptualization of the study, where international trade has this mainstream approach that looks at liberalization as key towards promoting development. when you open markets, then your countries, you are able to trade. And this comes in from the free trade, the doctrine of free trade. Then we also have the critiques of free trade, and then I come into that balanced approach. So when you look at, when you take a step backward and look at all these elements, the theoretical approaches, we see the three approaches becoming prominent. And now the agenda setting of DDCs in this case, DDCs have been a lot reactive. One has to do with also capacity, but two, also the interest. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, DDC's interest in the WTO, when you look at the WTO, their interest is to settle what they call the unfinished agenda, the Doha development agenda, which has a comprehensive package that developed countries have promised to address in order to promote their development. And so this is the reason why these countries then are prominent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Collins.
Thank you. I would like to ask a related methodological question. Could you please explain your justification for your choice of 3 African countries as points of analysis for your discussion of digital trade agreements? If your intention is to present general conclusions regarding developing countries' approach to digital trade, why were no non-African countries chosen? So, for example, do Latin American countries share the same concerns as African countries?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Yeah, the methodological choice I made in choosing these 3 African countries. One, I was looking for a way to have a more comprehensive, or a more in-depth focus in terms of the steps countries have taken, DDCs have taken to promote the development of their digital economies. But the interesting part is that these countries are also part of the East African community. And so they are integrating. Increasingly, they have a common market. It's not as advanced as that of the EU, but they have ambition to be much more integrated than even the EU. So that means whatever is agreed at JSI, or if they are to agree to an e-commerce agreement independently, they would still be affected as all these countries. So when I try to look at the Latin American countries, I felt that for me to I felt that for me to have a deeper and comprehensive study, I need to focus on these 3 countries. Thank you.
Martin Munu, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and of your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. Martin Munu, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Coppens is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I here confer upon you, Martin Luther Munu, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Dear Dr. Munu, dear Martin, I'm delighted to be the first to call you by your new title and to congratulate you on behalf of your whole supervisory committee, Marta, Dominic and I, on this special occasion. I remember very well when we first met online after you had discussed with Marta your ambition to do a PhD in law. Already then your CV was very impressive. You had done a master's in globalization and development with distinction at the University of Antwerp. You had worked as a research analyst and a program officer at reputable institutions in Uganda. And you already had 12 reports and publications behind your name. We were very impressed. But more than that, we were impressed by your courage in taking on a very technical and difficult topic of WTO law, e-commerce, even being a non-lawyer. This was very challenging, but you resolutely accepted this challenge. And you participated in a very competitive round for only 4 internal PhD positions, which you successfully obtained. Then the chair of the science committee, who was Frans Schoolmans at the time, remarked that your topic had very much potential, but that it would require very hard work to get there. And he was right on both counts. Now, the road to your success has been one longer than you and we anticipated. But this was not because of lack of commitment or lack of talent on your part, but instead, your success is all the more exceptional because it was achieved despite adverse circumstances. These included the obstacles presented by COVID-19 and other personal difficulties encountered by you and your family, but also by the fact that your supervisory committee changed in both the availability of the supervisors, but also the composition of your supervisory team. You accepted all these challenges with good grace and flexibility, for which we thank you. Fortunately, in 2022, Dominic joined our team, and he was instrumental in getting you to the finish line. We all admired your tenacity and your refusal to be disheartened. You responded constructively to feedback. You showed openness to fundamentally rethinking the focus of some of your key chapters in order to align them better with your talents and your background. You are also to be commended for your strong development focus and the ambition to produce innovative academic work that ensures that trade rules do more than merely pay lip service to the needs of developing countries. And this development focus has also been seen in activities that you carried out in parallel to your PhD research. Not only did you give development-focused presentations at the annual PEPA conferences of the Society of International Economic Law, also at the University of Essex Summer School and at the University of Hohenheim, but you were also willing to share your insights with the general public through interviews for the Kenya Television Network and Business Africa on issues of trade and economic stability in Africa. You presented at the UNCTAD e-commerce week on the implications of e-commerce rules for development, and your various publications touch on issues ranging from the effect of trade rules on taxation on the digital economy in Africa, the inclusiveness of the digitalization of basic services in Rwanda, and most recently, a report for the ILO on labor migration governance in Uganda. In many cases, you modestly did not even mention these achievements to us, and I was often happily surprised to come across your latest activity on my LinkedIn feed. On a more personal note, we, your supervisors, were glad that you never lost your warm smile, whether we met you in the office or cycling through Maastricht. And this smile got even bigger when you spoke with love about your young family, Dorothy, Aubriana, and Alwyn. They followed you to Maastricht, and now they rightly share in your success. We wish you every happiness in your future professional career. And we have no doubt that we will hear of you many times in the years to come. But for now, enjoy today's achievement.
Dear Dr. Munu, also on behalf of Maastricht University, it is my pleasure to formally congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. Our previous dean, Professor Jan Smets, used to say at these occasions, the doctorate is the highest degree that can be awarded to you in an academic institution. You have acquired it, so you can be very proud of it. Congratulations. Now, let me tell you something about what will happen now. You, together with the committee, will go to the staircase in the building where we can take some pictures. If some of your family members can join us as photographer, they will do the picture scene. We will ask the people, the audience, to wait for a moment, maybe in the hall or whatever, because then we go to the refectory with the whole group, and then first the members of the committee and later the general audience can congratulate the young Dr. Munu. Having said this, I now formally close this meeting.